Welcome to section 5, our 10 hot topics list for Beago. Do note that in terms of the source of these hot topics, really they're based, as you'll see, on the PreSeen, but also past exams and indeed my gut instinct based on what I've seen in terms of the information provided for Beago. Let's look at hot topic number 1. Now, this is quite an obvious one for me, because when we look at the PreSeen, we look at Beago's situation, the whole area of IT and IS is central to their success. In fact, that's what they've leveraged their growth in revenues on over the last 12 years or thereabouts. So any attack on their systems could be disastrous. Now, we know the area, Chapter 17. What we need to do is we need to get familiar with the different types of threats. And in addition to that, we need to have a feel for perhaps actions that could be taken, let's say after some sort of attack on their systems. Let's remember that the business model for Beago is very, very straightforward. On the one hand, they have their customers and their customers signing up via the app. And indeed, in addition to that, they have the drivers and drivers signing up with the app. So really, the business model is very straightforward, but at the end of the day, they hold a tremendous amount of information in relation to individual customers, drivers, etc. So, the prospect of the examiner focusing in on their business model and creating a scenario in some way where there's concern or an attack has happened is absolutely 100% possible. Now you'll see here that I've linked the article that's shown within Chapter 17. I do think it's a good idea to take a look at that. NCSC, click on the link, go through and take a careful look. But let's be ready for this topic because I think it's a good one based on the PreSeen. Let's take a look at number 2. Now, again, this is very much sort of PreSeen related. We know where Beago sits in terms of its business. And indeed, we know the problems that have arisen in inner cities, urbanization, etc. So at the end of the day, Beago has a responsibility towards the public. They're providing transport, health and safety is an issue. They also have a responsibility towards their drivers. So this whole area of the public interest, what it means, what the responsibilities are for companies, TNCs like Beago, I think is central to this particular PreSeen. So again, the technical content is not overly problematic. It's not complex at all. This is a very, very good area for us. Let's get into Chapter 3. Let's understand what we mean by public interest. And let's see the difference between companies acting in the public interest and perhaps companies that aren't. Note that this obviously links into an area that I've discussed elsewhere in the course, social responsibility. And the idea that companies such as Beago in this particular market in Beeland, need to be socially responsible. And indeed, they need to be good corporate citizens. Okay, so that's number 2. Let's take a look at number 3. Now, again, this particular model has been examined. Let's be careful on tools and techniques within the SBL exam. In other words, where we see exam requirements, questions, it's highly unlikely, in fact, not likely at all, that the examiner will specifically mention a particular model. He has done in the past, but it's unusual. So what we need to do is we need to be ready for all models. Ansoff's matrix is one in our hot topics list. There are others. I'll come to them in a moment. But this particular model, I think, is a great model for this PreSeen. And the reason for that is when we look at the Beeland market, broadly speaking, you could say that that market right just now is saturated. It's very, very hot. We've got 2 big players. We've got smaller number of small competitors, and we've got competitors entering the market. So my point is this. The idea that expansion in some way, shape or form wouldn't be on the cards for Beago and indeed the executive board doesn't make sense. They've got to find other ways to expand. And what better tool to use than Igor Ansov's matrix? The matrix, as we saw within the strategic analysis, is hinged on product or service expansion in an existing or new market. One key area that I've emphasized within the strategic analysis section where I've dealt with Ansov is, of course, market development. Now, that could lead into a number of areas. What do we mean by market development? I'm talking about expansion overseas. I'm talking about, let's say, the existing products and services in a new market. Now, there's some risk associated with that, as I've said within the strategic analysis. Obviously, if they launch into another country, they have expertise, they have core competence, but they don't know that country. So this nicely links in to risk and indeed evaluation of risks, risk management, etc. So for me, Ansov's matrix, chapter 12, is a good topic for us. My experience of marking scripts where Ansov's matrix is in play in one way or another is I find that students really don't have a solid understanding of each of the 4 quadrants and indeed the terminology. We've got to, because this particular model fits extremely well, I think, with this PreSeen. Let's revise in detail chapter 12. Next one is again linked to what I've just said, but I've taken a different angle here. Now, I would say I would put Ansov's matrix and indeed Porter's diamond at the same level in terms of importance. And the reason for that is clearly the examiner likes the diamond. He's examined it several times, but more pertinently, this is a model that really assesses key determinants within a given industry or market and the reasons for the growth of that market. I use the example of the German car industry, but in our case with TNCs, there were a number, and there are a number of factors, or if you will, determinants that have come together to drive the success of this industry. Let's think about it. Beago's only been in existence for 12 years. Look at the revenues. Now, I know they've been assisted by the advent of the internet, disruptive tech, etc., but the bottom line is that this particular model could easily be woven into a question where the examiner perhaps targets another country and gives you an exhibit or maybe more than one, talking about aspects of that particular country, and maybe it fits in. In other words, maybe the determinants are there, but maybe they aren't. And the examiner asking you to comment. In other words, to really dig deep into an exhibit or two, use your common sense and advise the board. Okay? So that's a good one, as is the one before. Next area here, I would include this particular area, ethical dilemmas, in probably every hot topic list. In fact, I have for the last 2 sittings. Now, we know what ethics is. It's pretty straightforward. The difference between right and wrong. But this is a question that asks you, let's say, to advise the board in relation to a particular ethical dilemma. Now, it could be related to the drivers, it could be related to customers, it could be related to staff, it could be related to anything. But at the end of the day, the steps are the same. Now, I've highlighted the AAA code. That's the American Association of Accounting. Do have a look at that. There's around about 7 steps there. It's very, very straightforward. You need to be able to write out and guide, let's say, the CEO and or the executive board in terms of actions to take where they're faced with a tricky situation, an ethical dilemma. Also, in terms of the syllabus, we know that there are a number of possible threats, pretty straightforward, and indeed safeguards. So hot topic number 5, again, as I've said, is an area that I would include in most hot topic lists. Let's get into the detail. In terms of number 6, again, this would be the type of question that I would include in any hot topics list, because case study examiners like this style of question. Now, it may look a little bit unusual because I've said, well, question theme is strategic benefits and risks of X. And you'd be looking at the screen now and thinking, well, what do you mean, Paul? X? Well, I mean anything. So really what I'm talking about is a style of question where the examiner presents you with a situation. Let's just say it's a strategic option. To simplify it, let's say we're talking about expansion abroad, as we said above. Now, the examiner will simply say, given the scenario, given the information that you've been provided with, outline the strategic benefits and risks of Beago launching into ABC country. Now, it's quite straightforward. Now, if it's not expansion into another country, it could be something else. But my point is this: the strategic and benefits and risks of most options are not dissimilar. Simple example, strategic benefits. In what scenario, in what case would a strategic benefit in relation to this option not include increased revenue, increased profitability? Everything that companies do, whether or not they're TNC like Beago or not, is going to be done with the possibility or the prospect or the hope of better profitability, more revenue, increased market share, etc., etc. Now, flip side, let's take a look at the risks. Again, we can pre-prepare for this question, because if we think about the simple scenario that I gave you, i.e. expansion abroad, what are the strategic risks? Well, what about business risk? How about it doesn't work? In other words, they invest, they waste money and they don't get what they want. So my point with hot topic number 6 is not that it's linked to a specific topic area, but it's a style of question that if you look back to September 2018, you'll see it come up in one way or another several times, more than likely with this terminology. So, this is a gimme question, and indeed not a difficult one to pre-prepare for. Okay, let's take a look at number 7. Disruptive tech. Now, you'll be looking at the screen saying, well, that's pretty obvious. Of course it is. And if we look at the industry and indeed the market over the course of... Let's take a look at number 7 now. And this is one that we would expect. Given the vagaries and the changes in the business environment of transport and transportation, you'll be familiar with the disruptors in the industry. And I'd refer you to the industry example section also, where I deal with a number of real-life scenarios, real-life companies, quite a lot of useful information this time around in relation to the industry, as shown within the industry example section. So, in terms of hot topic number 7, obviously we're familiar with chapter 24. We know the areas that are included. It's difficult to say exactly how the examiner would approach disruptive tech, but broadly speaking, looking at the past, i.e. since September 2018, we're talking about really implementation. We're talking about issues associated with disruptive tech. We're talking about perhaps impact, change management, etc. So be familiar with the past questions. That gives you a feel for how he will come at this. Clearly within this particular industry, are there other industries that have been more impacted upon by tech or disruptive tech than transport? Well, perhaps a few, but not too many. Okay? So that is hot topic number 7. Let's get into chapter 24. Remember, as I've said elsewhere, don't be concerned about being some sort of expert, for example, in AVs, autonomous vehicles, or indeed EVs. Really what we're talking about is sort of practical common sense issues in terms of a company like Beago having to deal with issues associated with disruptive tech, as just mentioned. Let's take a look at number 8 now. Now, here's an interesting one. And again, the reason that I've included this is obviously past exams and PreSeen. But if you look at the TNC market in real life, what you're going to see is that companies, a variety of different companies, not least Lyft, etc., they tend to team up. They like exploring ways of developing strategy. So I'm talking about within chapter 13, the possible methods of development. So, JVs, joint ventures, strategic alliances, etc. Be familiar with the terminology. I mean, clearly a company like Beago, in the driving seat within this industry in Beeland, has so many possible routes forward. I've mentioned within Ansof's matrix above, the 4 quadrants: market, product development, penetration, etc. But this particular area is slightly different. Chapter 13 talks about ways in which. So let's just say they could team up or JV with another new entity offering a particular type of, let's say, disruptive tech. Okay? So revise chapter 13 and this area of possible methods forward in terms of strategy development. So that's number 8. Number 9, again, this one I included last time round, and I believe the sitting before, only because really, obviously for a company like this, investing in the future is important, but also this is just a common exam topic within SBL. And the level of detail that the examiner goes into is not overly complex. Now, we're familiar with investment appraisal techniques. We've been seeing those in other subject areas for some time. We know the big ones. We know IRR, we know about NPV. What we need to be able to do is to compare the methods and also understand the limitations, let's say, of a prospective proposal, a project. So perhaps the examiner will provide you with some calculations or some ideas in relation to several ventures and ask you to comment on them. So make sure you're familiar with the various techniques, their assumptions, and indeed note the limitations. Calculations not overly important. We know that SBL isn't a calculation numerical style exam, but make sure you're familiar with the theory. Okay? Last one for us, again, this is a hot topic really for me across all case study exams. This is an area that's easily woven into a case study and case study questions. And indeed, it's an area, forgetting about Beago, that's so important for business. I remember reading a quote once where a particular theorist in this area said, 70% of all change fails. So making changes for businesses, whether or not you're Beago or another company, is difficult. And that's what chapter 25 is about. It's about tools, e.g. Lewin's models, or possibly KNS, Coulthard's Ledger. It's about actions that, a company like Beago can take to minimize the possibility of change going wrong, managing change forward. Now, Lewin is the big theorist there. Coulthard and Sledger I also like. So let's be familiar with what change means, the difficulties, why change fails, and indeed the models. Okay? So that sort of concludes our hot topics list. Now, as I said from the outset, hot topics are a great thing for us to include in the course. And you'll know that other tuition bodies do so too. But, we're really talking about broad themes. You've got to be familiar with the underlying theory. And if we get lucky, great. If we don't, then that's okay too, because we have other things up our sleeve in terms of, for example, how much we've practiced. Let's be ready for any topic. If the hot topic area, if we don't get lucky, and I think we probably will in one way, shape or form, because generally I get something in the exam. But if it doesn't happen, fair enough. We push on. We use our technique, we use our skills, etc. Okay? So listen, thanks for listening. Hope you found that helpful. As remember, do take a look at the industry example section. That does link nicely into one or two areas within this particular section of the course. Okay? Cheers now.